We all know what it's like to be wronged. The sharp sting of betrayal, the quiet weight of unkind words, the hidden wound of a deep hurt inflicted by someone we trusted. These moments linger in the heart like splinters, gnawing at our peace and poisoning our thoughts. There is an instinct, a deeply rooted feeling within us, to take matters unto our own hands, to set things right in our own way, and to ensure that justice is served. Yet we must ask ourselves, how do we handle those who have hurt us? How do we respond to the injustices, the wounds and the wrongs that others have caused us? Forgiveness is one of the most profound and transformative actions we can undertake, especially when we are faced with those who have wronged or hurt us. When we are hurt by others, our natural instinct may be to hold on to the pain, to nurse our wounds, and to demand justice. We seek retribution, not for the sake of righteousness, but because we want to balance the scales, to make sure that the wrongs committed against us do not go unpunished. We may want the person who hurt us to feel the weight of their actions, to experience the same hurt they caused us. But when we hold on to bitterness and resentment, we are not only hurting the other person, we are also hurting ourselves. Forgiveness, however, does not mean condoning or excusing the wrongs that have been done to us. It is not a passive act where we simply ignore the pain or pretend as though it did not happen. In truth, forgiveness is a courageous act of releasing the burden of anger, resentment, and hurt. It is a deliberate decision to let go of the desire to take vengeance into our own hands. It is at its core a choice to stop allowing the offense to control us. Forgiveness is an act of grace, grace extended to others, but also, importantly, to ourselves. When we forgive, we are not doing so because the person who hurt us deserves it. We are doing so because we deserve to be free from the chains of bitterness that bind us. We choose to free our hearts from the poison of unforgiveness. In this journey of forgiveness, it is important to recognize that we are not alone. We do not forgive out of our own strength or out of an innate ability to simply move on. Rather, we forgive because we have been forgiven. This understanding is crucial because it shifts our perspective entirely. When we remember the grace that God has shown us, the forgiveness He has extended to us despite our own shortcomings, we are compelled to reflect that same grace and mercy to others. We recognize that our forgiveness is not earned, and neither is the forgiveness of others. Just as God, in His love and mercy, has chosen to forgive us, we are called to extend that same forgiveness to those who have hurt us. Forgiveness in this light is not about overlooking the offense or pretending that the hurt doesn't matter. It is about choosing to release the other person from the debt we believe they owe us. When we forgive, we are no longer waiting for an apology, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or some form of justice. We let go of the need to make the other person pay by their actions, and we surrender that responsibility. The act of forgiving is an act of faith. Faith that God is the true judge, that He sees the wrongs done to us, and that He will handle the consequences in His own way and in His own time. This act of surrender does not mean we are weak or passive. In fact, it takes great strength to forgive, because it requires us to trust that God will do what is right. When we allow God to take charge of the situation, we free ourselves from the emotional and mental burden that comes with harboring unforgiveness. Holding on to anger and resentment is like carrying a heavy weight that we are not meant to bear. It drains us. This focus on the wrongs done to us, this preoccupation with the offense, prevents us from moving forward in life. It holds us in a place of bondage. Forgiveness is not a one-time act, but rather a continuous choice. It is something we may have to do repeatedly, especially when the wounds are deep, or when the offense continues to surface in our hearts and minds. Each time we forgive, we choose to let go again and again. This can be a difficult and painful process, The forgiveness does not necessarily mean we will forget the offense, or that the relationship will be immediately restored to its previous state. It may take time for trust to be rebuilt, and it may be necessary to set boundaries to protect ourselves. However, forgiveness means we are no longer holding on to the bitterness and anger that prevent us from experiencing true healing. There is great power in forgiveness, not only for the one who is forgiven, but also for the one who forgives. When we forgive, we are not only releasing the other person from the debt we believe they owe us, but we are also releasing ourselves from the prison of unforgiveness. Unforgiveness holds us captive. It keeps us bound to the pain and hurt, unable to move forward in our lives. Forgiveness, on the other hand, frees us from that prison, allowing us to experience the fullness of life, unburdened by the weight of resentment. It opens the door for healing to take place in our hearts, minds, and relationships. Moreover, forgiveness restores our sense of peace and joy. The more we forgive, the more we allow God to work in and through us, transforming our hearts and minds in the process. For forgiveness is not easy. It is not a natural response when we are hurt, but it is the only path to true freedom, peace, and healing. It is a decision to trust God with the hurt, to let go of the desire for revenge, and to walk in the grace that He has shown us. When we forgive, we are not minimizing the pain or the wrongs that were done to us. We are choosing to release the burden of unforgiveness and trusting that God will handle the rest. In doing so, we are set free, we are healed, and we are able to walk forward, no longer weighed down by the past, but with hearts full of peace, compassion, and love. When we are wronged, it is easy to be consumed with a desire for justice. Our hearts cry out for fairness, for the wrongdoer to feel the weight of their actions, for the scales of justice to be balanced. This desire for retribution is natural, and it's a deeply human response to being hurt. Yet we must remember that true justice is not in our hands, and trying to force our own sense of justice can lead us down a destructive path. It is in trusting God's justice that we find peace and release from the turmoil that comes from holding on to anger and resentment. God's justice is far greater than our own. We see only a fraction of the picture. Our vision is clouded by emotions, personal biases, and limited understanding. We cannot see the depths of the heart, the reasons behind actions, or the full consequences of decisions. Only God can see the complete picture. He is the one who knows the heart, who understands the intricacies of human relationships, and who can bring about true justice in a way that is perfectly righteous and complete. When we release our desire for personal revenge and trust God with the situation, we are acknowledging that His ways are higher than ours. When we act on our own sense of justice, we may feel a fleeting sense of satisfaction or relief, but this often comes at a great cost. Vengeance breeds more bitterness and anger, perpetuating a cycle of hurt that does nothing to heal the wound. In trying to right the wrong, we can easily become entangled in a web of bitterness that only deepens our own pain. The moment we take matters into our own hands, we are no longer in control of our emotions. We allow anger and resentment to drive our actions, leading us to decisions we may regret later. This is why it is so important to trust God's justice instead of relying on our own understanding or feeling. Trusting in God's justice doesn't mean that we ignore the wrong that was done to us, nor does it mean that we simply allow the person who hurt us to continue in their ways without consequences. It means that we place the situation in God's hands, knowing that He sees what we cannot see, and He is capable of handling it far better than we ever could. It is the recognition that God is not blind to our suffering, that He is aware of the injustice, and that He will act in accordance with His perfect will. This trust is rooted in faith, the belief that God is both just and merciful, that He will not let the wrong go unaddressed, but he will also offer the opportunity for repentance and reconciliation. When we trust God with justice, we free ourselves from the burden of anger and bitterness. We no longer have to carry the weight of seeking retribution, of constantly replaying the hurt in our minds, or of plotting how to make the other person suffer. This trust allows us to focus on healing, to move forward without being tethered to the past. Holding on to the desire for revenge keeps us stuck, locked in the past, unable to move on. But when we release this desire and trust in God's justice, we open ourselves to healing and peace. God's justice is also tempered by His grace. While we long for others to be held accountable for their actions, we must also recognize our own need for grace. We too have fallen short, and we too have been recipients of God's mercy. When we trust in God's justice, we acknowledge that He has the power to offer forgiveness and restoration to those who have wronged us, just as He has done for us. It is not our place to judge or condemn others, but to leave that to God. His justice is not vengeful, it is restorative. His goal is not to destroy the wrongdoer, but to bring them to repentance, healing, and transformation. When we trust God with the situation, we trust that He will work in the other person's heart as well, in ways we may never fully understand. In trusting God's justice, we also learn to release our desire for control. It is easy to want to make things right, to right the wrongs that have been done to us, but we must acknowledge that we are not the ultimate authority. We do not have the power to change another person's heart or to dictate the outcome of every situation. Only God has that authority. When we trust in His justice, we surrender our need to control the situation. We place our faith in His ability to bring about what is right, and we choose to release our grip on the circumstance. Ultimately, trusting in God's justice frees us from the toxic cycle of anger, resentment, and revenge. By doing so, we free ourselves from the chains of bitterness and anger, and we open ourselves to healing and peace. Trusting God with justice is a powerful act of faith, and it is the path to true freedom. Releasing control over our desire for retribution and allowing God to handle those who hurt us is one of the most difficult yet liberating decisions we can make. It requires a deep level of trust that, despite the pain we feel, God's ways are higher than ours, and His ability to bring justice is far more complete and righteous than anything we could orchestrate. This surrender of control is not a sign of weakness or passivity. When we are hurt, especially by those we love or trust, it is natural to want to defend ourselves, to seek vindication, and to have the wrongdoer held accountable. The emotions that arise from hurt can be all-consuming. Anger, bitterness, and a sense of betrayal cloud our judgment and often drive us to act impulsively, fueled by the desire to make the other person pay for their actions. The instinct to right the wrong is deeply embedded in human nature, and it is easy to think that the only way to heal from the hurt is by ensuring the wrongdoer faces the consequences of their actions. But the reality is that this kind of thinking only prolongs the pain and keeps us entangled in the very thing that caused us harm in the first place. When we decide to take matters into our own hands, we may find temporary relief in feeling like we've regained some control over the situation, but this control is an illusion. Our efforts to seek justice on our terms often lead to more hurt, confusion, and an unrelenting cycle of resentment. We may feel justified in our anger, but the truth is, this anger does nothing to heal us. It only ties us to the past, keeps us tethered to the pain, and prevents us from experiencing true freedom. In reality, holding on to bitterness, the decision to release control is not about ignoring the wrongs done to us or pretending that the hurt doesn't matter. It is about recognizing that God's justice is far greater than our own. God sees every injustice, every wrong, every betrayal. He knows the hearts of those who hurt us, and He understands the full extent of the damage caused. When we place our trust in God's justice, we acknowledge that He is not blind to our suffering, that He is fully aware of the pain we are enduring, and that He will address the wrong in His perfect way and in His perfect timing. This does not mean that God will automatically punish those who have wronged us, or that they will face immediate consequences, but it does mean that we can trust Him to bring about what is right in a way that is consistent with His nature. It is important to remember that God's justice is not always the same as our own understanding of justice. We may have a strong desire for retribution, for the wrongdoer to face the same pain they inflicted upon us. We want them to experience the consequences of their actions, to feel the depth of the hurt they caused. But God's justice is God's ultimate goal is not to punish the wrongdoer, but to bring them to repentance, to bring healing to their soul, and to restore the relationship if possible. We, as human beings, are often driven by emotions that cloud our ability to see beyond the immediate situation, and we may not fully grasp the broader impact of God's justice. But when we trust Him with a situation, we can rest assured that He will act in a way that is just, merciful, and ultimately redemptive. By releasing our desire for retribution and trusting God to handle those who hurt us, we free ourselves from the weight of unforgiveness. Holding on to bitterness and resentment is like carrying a heavy burden that prevents us from moving forward. The longer we hold on to the hurt, the more it festers and poisons our heart. But when we choose to let go and trust God, we release ourselves from the prison of anger and hurt. We stop allowing the wrongdoer to control our emotions, and we open ourselves up to healing and peace. Letting go of control and trusting God also allows us to live in freedom. When we are consumed with anger or the desire for revenge, we are not living freely. We are shackled by our emotions, constantly reliving the past and unable to experience the fullness of life. Releasing control gives us the space to focus on our own healing, to let go of the pain, and to move forward. God has promised that He will never leave us nor forsake us, and He will not allow us to suffer needlessly. When we place our trust in Him, we acknowledge that He is our ultimate protector, and we no longer need to take matters into our own hands. The act of surrendering control is also a recognition of our own limitations. We do not have the power to change another person's heart, nor do we have the ability to dictate how things should unfold. We can only control our own reactions and responses. When we trust God to handle the situation, we acknowledge that He is the one who holds all authority, and that He knows what is best for us. We may not understand why certain things happen, and we may not see the outcome immediately, but we can trust that God's plans are always for our good. His timing is perfect, and His actions are always for our benefit. This surrender of control also deepens our relationship with God. It is an act of faith to release our hurt into His hands and trust Him to deal with it. In doing so, we draw nearer to Him and experience a deeper sense of peace. When we try to handle things ourselves, we are often working from a place of fear or pride. But when we surrender, we acknowledge that God is in control, and we place our full trust in His power and goodness. This act of surrender is not easy, but it is one of the most powerful ways to experience God's peace and healing in the midst of pain. Releasing control does not mean that we forget about the wrong or that we excuse the behavior of the one who hurt us. It means that we trust God to handle the situation in a way that is just, merciful, and ultimately redemptive. By letting go of our desire for revenge, we allow God to step in and act on our behalf. This act of surrender leads to healing, freedom, and peace. It is a difficult decision to make, but it is one that ultimately brings us. There is a unique healing that takes place when we choose to surrender our hurt to God and trust Him to handle the people who have caused us pain. This act of surrender is not passive or weak. It requires strength, courage, and a deep faith in God's ability to heal, restore, and ultimately bring about justice in a way that is far beyond our own capability. When we attempt to manage our hurt and the pain caused by others, choosing to let God handle the hurt caused by others allows us to step out of the cycle of vengeance and bitterness that so often keeps us bound. When we take on the responsibility of trying to make the wrongdoer feel the consequences of their actions, we end up carrying the weight of that responsibility ourselves. The burden of anger and revenge is heavy and can consume us, draining us of the energy we need to focus on our own healing and growth. By surrendering this burden to God, we release ourselves from the emotional and spiritual weight that is too great for us to carry alone. This surrender is an act of trust. When we give the situation over to God, we acknowledge that His understanding of justice and righteousness is far superior to ours. We do not always know what is best for the person who has wronged us, and we certainly do not see the full picture of their heart, their motives, or the circumstances surrounding their actions. God, however, sees it all. He is able to bring about justice in a way that is both perfect and merciful. His justice does not come from a place of vindictiveness, but from a desire to bring restoration, healing, and reconciliation. Trusting God to handle the hurt and the one who caused it requires faith that He will deal with the situation according to His wisdom and timing, and that He will bring good from the pain we have experienced. The act of letting go of the need for revenge also allows us to focus on healing rather than on the wrong itself. When we cling to our hurt and hold on to the anger that comes from being wronged, we remain emotionally tethered to the person who hurt us. We allow them to continue to have power over our thoughts, our feelings, and our lives. But when we surrender the situation to God, we free ourselves from this emotional bondage. We are no longer tied to the pain and the hurt, and we can begin to focus on our own healing. This healing may not come overnight, and it may require a period of time for God to work in our hearts. Moreover, choosing to let God handle those who hurt us is also an invitation to deeper growth. Through the process of forgiveness and surrender, we are not only releasing the wrongdoer, but also growing in compassion, understanding, and empathy. It can be difficult to forgive, especially when the hurt runs deep. But in doing so, we are given the opportunity to reflect God's love and mercy. When we forgive, we begin to understand the depths of the grace that has been extended to us. We are reminded that we too have sinned and fallen short, and yet God has forgiven us. This recognition brings us closer to the heart of God and allows us to extend the same grace to others that has been given to us. Furthermore, the process of healing through surrender brings freedom. When we hold on to anger, resentment, and the need for revenge, we are shackled by those emotions. We are unable to move forward, and we allow the actions of others to dictate our emotional state. But when we let go and trust God, we free ourselves from these chains. We no longer need to be controlled by our hurt, but we can step into the freedom that comes with trusting God to handle the situation. This freedom is not simply the absence of anger, but the presence of peace, joy, and hope that comes from knowing that God is in control and will work all things for our good. In letting God handle those who hurt us, we also acknowledge that we are not alone in our suffering. God is with us in our pain, and He is working on our behalf. He has promised to be our comforter, our healer, and our advocate. When we release our hurt to God, we are not left empty-handed. We are filled with His presence, His peace, and His love. We find strength in His promises, and we are able to endure with hope, knowing that He is at work in the midst of our trials. This strength is not our own, but His strength made perfect in our weakness. And it is through this strength that we are able to extend forgiveness, to release our hurt, and to trust that He will bring about justice in His time. Choosing to let God handle those who hurt us is a transformative act. It is a decision to surrender our right to control and to place our trust in the hands of a loving, just, and merciful God. It is not an easy choice, but it is the path to freedom, healing, and peace. As we release the burden of unforgiveness and vengeance, we open ourselves to the healing work that God wants to do in our hearts. And in doing so, we reflect the love and mercy of Christ, who, despite the pain He endured, chose forgiveness, healing, and restoration for the sake of us all.